Thank you very much, everyone. Now, the first question you might well ask is, why post-capitalism? What is wrong with capitalism itself that can't be put right? I use the word capitalism because that's what most people understand. But in my book and in my writings, I tend to refer to it as the profit system, because that, I think, defines its essence. It enables people to understand what it's all about. I'm not going to attempt to describe all the ills of capitalism, which are many, and a lot of which you know about. But I mean, it's a fact that 20 years ago, it would have, anyone suggesting that there was anything much wrong with capitalism would have, and I indeed fell into that category, would have been laughed out of court, because the Iron Curtain had just collapsed, the Berlin Wall had come down, and surely that meant the triumph of free market capitalism. Somebody even called it the end of history. Well, these people even now are essentially fighting rearguard action. And I have noticed since the crisis really broke seriously about 5 years ago, people have been asking the question, well, what is to be done about capitalism? Has it got a future? These are the kind of things you hear said on the BBC and discussion programs. And they invariably come to the conclusion, in my experience, that capitalism has a lot of things wrong with it, but actually fundamentally it's the best system we can possibly devise, and it is something we can't possibly improve on, or not essentially. You might have better regulation, but you essentially couldn't have a better system. Certainly not one which replaces the profit motive. Now, I think this poses an interesting analytical problem, or analytical flaw in their whole position, because they're really starting from the position, it seems to me, that capitalism at some point was a system which we selected. And we chose it. We said, you've got different systems, and that capitalism, this is the one we'll take because it's the best one. Where that's what I call the creationist view of capitalism. In other words, it was there in the beginning, and on the third day, God created credit default swaps, and behold, they were very good. and so we have this. We have this structure which somehow can be perpetuated. That's how it came about. Now the reality, and this is where I'm so glad that the Marxist group are represented here, because this is where Marx and Engels made perhaps their most important single contribution as young men to the, well, I'm exaggerating perhaps, but a very important contribution to our understanding of things, where they pointed out brilliantly in the first part of the Communist Manifesto that capitalism, which they incidentally they never used the word as far as I know, they called it the bourgeois mode of production. It came into being because of technological change, and because large volumes of capital were needed to be mobilized to get the industry in the Industrial Revolution going, and particularly things like railways. And so that was the essential feature, that you had mobilized all this capital. And it therefore was a process. It evolved therefore out of feudalism. Now the point, I'm sure, if they were alive today, they would be saying to us is that process of evolution is still going on. And that's the way history, in fact, is determined. We, as a species, we evolve from one stage to another. And therefore, just as capitalism came into being as a result of technological evolution, so the next economic system which we have will evolve out of capitalism. And therefore, the idea of saying that there is no alternative to this system is quite ludicrous and intellectually disreputable. I mean, possibly in 1789, when the States General were assembling at Versailles, King Louis XVI and his friends said to the assembled delegates, "There is no alternative to feudal aristocracy." Well, look what happened to them. I think as far as that's concerned, I rest my case. Now, of course, capitalism has had a lot of other problems, which many of you know about, over the generations. And the most serious of which, and even recognised by its defenders, is the business cycle, which leads to periodic instability and mass unemployment. And this has produced at least two very major crises in the history of the last 200 years. The first was the Great Depression of the 1840s, which resulted in absolutely massive suffering across Europe and produced a wave of revolutions on the continent in 1848. And then, of course, in the 1930s, we had another one, which gave us World War II and 60 million dead. So, even with the benefits of all its successes, if you can call them that, through assembling industry and giving us the benefits of modern industry, capitalism had huge problems. And that is even before that it started to evolve into something else. Now, my contention, and I've written about this, and most of what I'm saying to you, I should interject, is completely unoriginal. Nearly all of it can be found in different writers in different times, even from the Victorian era. What we see now, I'm arguing, and that's why I say there's no possibility of capitalism returning to business as usual, as its supporters claim is possible, is primarily because, in fact, the technology has evolved further to a point where we need far less capital than we have done hitherto to keep the economy going. And the whole point about capitalism is it is a system of recycling the profits into new investment. Now, I don't propose to go into this in great detail, but just to give you one example. The reason one can define, or one reason one can define the failure, or identify the failure of capitalism, because of this need for endlessly recycling profits into new investments, is privatization. Now, most of the industries which are privatized in this country, as I'm sure you know, the public utilities, were working perfectly well under state ownership. But unfortunately, private business wasn't making any money after it. So they suddenly decided, and these were businesses set up, like for example, the telephone service under the post office, set up by a Tory government in the 1890s under state ownership. And suddenly, about 70 years later, decided actually this would be better run by the private sector. Well, this case was never made. But the real reason was, and this is perhaps one of my few original contributions to the debate, if anyone was listening, I pointed out that this was the reason if this happened was simply because there was nothing else for people, very little else for big business to invest their profits in. So that is how we arrive at the stage where technology is rendering capitalism outmoded, and it's not because we need less and less capital. And where we do need capital, it's often for investments in public infrastructure and things like pharmaceutical development and research, which frankly can't make sufficient profits for the private sector, and that can only happen if they're hugely subsidised. So it's no longer needed. It's out of date, and we are therefore confronted with the need to see capital increasingly devalued. And the other point, which is even more significant in a way for the future, is that it's devaluing labour. Now this was foreseen a long time ago by less the Marxists, but Keynes for one, and even Victorian writers, and particularly, and I've only recently come across this, again, I must have read it when I was much younger, Oscar Wilde, in The Soul of Man Under Socialism, which was a book, I don't know if you're familiar with it, but if not, you should read it, because he wrote this after attending a Fabian Society meeting in London, I believe, with his fellow Irish playwright, George Bernard Shaw, who was one of the founders of Fabians. But in it, he really foresees the idea that man could be liberated from menial labour. He thought machines could do all the work. Now this was pure fantasy in the 1890s, you might say. But in the time to come, in the years which are now, in the era we're now entering, it will be absolutely normal and is entirely invisible. Now that doesn't mean that there won't be need for people to do other work, and that people indeed will still need to do some menial work, no doubt. But I have to reflect here, and I hope I won't upset too many people by saying this of some of the people who are more of my generation here. But I've known too many people, and indeed I've experienced what a lot of people do in employment is actually unnecessary. I mean, at least well over half the reports I've ever written, I would say as a consultant, didn't really add any value to anything except my bank account. And I could even argue that somebody who empties the bins every week, or looks after the old and infirm in hospital, they are doing a far more vital service than I have done as a supposed professional, paid twice as much as them, or more. Now, what the point of that is that we should only do, and this is where other Victorian thinkers like, for example, Ruskin, made quite a contribution in terms of their analysis, that really it is a crime to do work which doesn't need to be done. And yet we are constantly talking about job creation. We must create jobs for people to go and do. And the ultimate expression of this, under the new Labour administration, almost the first thing they did when they came in was to change the welfare rules governing single mothers. A lot of people remember this. Requiring them effectively to go out and get a job in order to get their welfare checked. And then with the welfare check, which they got when they were gone out to work, they paid somebody to come and mind their child. And this is why we have this insane system now where childcare is probably one of the few growth industries in the country. Whereas most parents, if they weren't required, both of them to go to work, just to keep it alive, the family together, they could actually look after their children much better, or maybe not. I mean, if you believe in a platonic kind of world in which nobody should look after their own children, and that that would somehow combat nepotism, but that's rather more futuristic. But I mean, the basic. Sorry, I've rather gone off the point there. But the point is that we live in a society where there's this constant search for creating work for people, and that is the very opposite of liberating. And we should look to the opportunity to work less and only do that work which is needed. Now, how do we arrive at this? I better look for a short time. We must. This brings me on to the vision of what the post-capitalist world would be like. And there, I would say that a key element of this is going to be a basic income that everyone will receive as a right. Now, I don't know how many of you are familiar with the concept of the basic income. It's certainly going to be quite difficult, I think, to sell this politically. But even now, some leading thinkers are starting to talk about it. Well, in fact, the idea goes back decades, almost 100 years since it was first proposed. Again, this is nothing new, but people keep the ideas off the agenda so that they can't be discussed. But basically, the idea is that everyone would have enough to survive. And we could certainly afford this without any trouble. And it would save the problems of having to create unnecessary work. It would save all the ridiculous investment in excessive infrastructure. Simply like, for example, the London Olympic Park, or I could say the HS2 railway, which serves no purpose at all in my view as an economist. And it is merely going to absorb lots of capital and give money to investors and create a few jobs on a rather temporary basis. And this whole idea, of urban redevelopment is a complete fraud. Sadly, something which even people supposedly on the left of the Labour movement have endorsed, like Ken Livingstone with his philosophy of gigantism in London, which made him resemble, if I may say so, rather more a typical kind of third world populist dictator. So we need to we need to adopt a basic income, and we need to also to share out what work needs to be done on a more rational basis. This will involve, dare I say, a degree of planning, and although not I hope of the Soviet type. My vision, and I mean you probably gather that these ideas are not well developed. They need to be discussed. We're not even having a discussion that the work needs to be shared out more. It needs, I would see a business being run on the basis of a non-profit basis, largely. Now, people will be allowed to make profits, but they will do so only insofar as the community agrees to it, and people are represented. One of the amazing features of modern capitalism is that corporations, big business, receives huge subsidies from the taxpayer to keep their businesses going, on the basis that will, on the assumption that is in the public good, that they make maximum profits. And the ultimate expression now of that is where we get these large companies supposedly benefiting us, which determine the right to determine how much tax they should pay. whereas the model which we should envisage and should be self-evident, I think, in a civilized society, is that if any corporation receives a subsidy, receives the protection of the state, it should only be entitled to that if the state, through representative institutions, has a say in what they do. And of course that means limiting their profits. Now, that is something which unfortunately well, I say unfortunately, but in reality would deter many of them from participating at all. And you would have possibly a decline in the private corporate sector, because they would see that they can't make money. And nobody, I think, I would not invest my money in any business if I thought I stood to lose it. I would need some sort of guarantee, and that is why, that is the whole essence of collectivism. That is rather obvious. So, another aspect of the model to come, and this is something I should have mentioned earlier, another reason why, factor we should take into consideration is the fact that we simply do not need to consume more, and indeed we need to consume less. And that is one reason why big business finds it harder to make profits. And instead of, whereas now, and I'm afraid our friend Lord Keynes bears some responsibility for this, because he, in his general theory, which I must say I have never read in its entirety, he talked about an idea called the paradox of thrift, which implies that we should all go out and consume as much as we can. And this is indeed doing a public service. Now, regardless of whether the quality of the meat we might be eating, the reality is we'd be much healthier if we ate less of it. And therefore, to the extent that it's believed we're doing a public service by consuming more than we actually need to, I would suggest that this is this is indeed a paradox of thrift, but it's certainly a paradox, and it's one which we should not consider it represents in any sense a public virtue. And the ultimate expression of this is when people are given incentive to trade in their cars, because there are about 30 or 40% too many cars manufactured in Europe. People are given tax incentives or price incentives to trade in their perfectly good models for a new one. And it's this kind of organised waste which has also given us the whole consumer society, which needs to be downgraded. And in its place, we need to talk about minimization of waste and limiting productions as far as possible. And that is what I envisage in the future. One of the aspects of this is you can't sell people more stuff, but also there is an environmental element to this. And one of the things which we're often told is that there's a shortage of food in the world, and that we won't be able to feed the population, so for that reason we need things like genetically modified crops. Well, in fact, if you look at the history of the last few centuries, you see that the population of the world took in between 1650 and 1850, approximately. The population of the world doubled to 1 billion. What does that tell you? It tells you that we have, whatever else may have gone wrong in that time, our capacity to feed more people, to provide them with a basic livelihood, has vastly increased. In other words, the old idea of a problem of scarcity which as we were taught as economists, this was the basis of economics, is the issue of scarcity and how to solve it. This has really been overcome. And believe me, there are massive resources available to feed the world's population. That is not the problem. The problem is other than that. It is rather that the other resources we need to live on, which depend on space, land and water, and air to breathe, these are becoming more hazardous, more difficult to provide, precisely because of the excess population. Now, I know there are people who feel quite strongly that we should not take a negative view about expanded population, some of them for religious reasons, but I suggest to you that we need to husband the Earth's resources much more. And this is a factor which I've only lately come to see is a major constraint also on continuing with a system like capitalism, which depends on everlasting economic growth. So what we come to is an economic system which will not depend on the profit motive. Why? Because the profit motive requires us endlessly to expand our output, and otherwise there will be no further demand to absorb the ever-growing supply of capital. And therefore we need to think of it in terms of a system which is stable rather than growing, which would be death to capitalism. And again, that may seem rather obvious. And I think there's not a lot more I can say about this, except that I think we probably, because it's so difficult to divide a system, and as I've said at the beginning, I believe in the evolution of systems, and therefore you can only evolve through experimentation in how you organise these things. But I personally don't believe that a system based on central planning will really work. Therefore, what we need is local planning and local enterprise and the maximum decentralisation of decision taking. That is also why I've come to the view, which I didn't believe in 30 or 40 years ago, that the whole idea of maximising international trade was a disastrous mistake, and that's why globalisation, one reason why globalisation has been such a folly. I don't want to say much more right now, and I'd like you to obviously comment and give your views on these things, but I think the one final statement I want to make at this stage is to say that the future model, the future type of economy we must have, should stress the values of cooperation rather than competition. Competition is all very well, and it has arguably, it can give us in certain circumstances considerable benefits as consumers, but it also, as capitalism has demonstrated, creates enormous problems. And in a world of stability, if we want to maintain stability and harmony, then we should have a different ideology. And the idea of competition, and each man for himself and the devil take the hindmost, this has to be seen as a totally pernicious doctrine from which we must retreat and be replaced with something more civilized. Thank you.